in the 1950s and 60s by Arnold Schwarzschild. Wrote a couple of very interesting monograms on the topic. Unfortunately, they're starting to be forgotten a bit, some of the very important lessons in there, so I revisited it and tried to add a bit of my own. So that's what I'm going to talk about. The data that I'm going to use is not my own, it's from the Shacklet Eye study from Iran. Shacklet is from a relatively small city somewhere near the Turkmenistan border. There are 2,000 people in that cohort, a little bit more women than men, about 50 years of age, and the refract error on average is about 0. So, sorry. Okay. That looks better, I guess. So let's get started with the biometry. So if you look at emmetropes can exist in quite a wide range here, between 20.8 millimeters and 25.6 millimeters. That's a range of 5 millimeters. So if Brennan was saying that 2 millimeters of chromatic aberration is a lot, this corresponds to 15 diopters. So, and the only way that these eyes can be emmetropic is through refractive development. It has to start early on, going all the way to adulthood. If anything goes wrong, that's going to be a massive myopia or hypermetropia. The reference here, these are European references, they're about the same, except the Iranian data is a little bit shorter. Those are ethnic differences, was mentioned also by Fabian this morning. There are some ethnic differences, but that's a different talk for a different time. Now, if you take the total corneal power and you project that as a function of action length, then you'll see that there is this very clear relationship. And that makes sense. If an eyeball is larger, the curvature is going to be flatter. There's nothing new there. Now, if you look at the colors represent refractive error. And you see, for the short action lengths, you see some blue here. For the long action lengths, you see some red. So that's myopia, that's hypermetropia. But everything in between here, everything is bunched up. Now, if you ask where are the emmetropes in this whole story, well, they're right there. They're everywhere. So, can you, based on corneal power and action length alone, tell whether an eye is emmetropic or not? Well, no, you can't. You need to have more information. So that's why, if you look at something like ALCR, so action length to corneal radius of curvature ratio, and you plot that as a function of the spherical equivalent, you see, yes, there is this linear relationship. There is, you can see that there's a bit two groups. That's again another story. That's the Börjeson aspect of it. But if you look at just the emmetropes, it looks like this. They have this massive range here, 2.7 until 3.2. So ALCR is not a very good measure for refractive error. It's not that well associated. Another thing is that if you have a certain action length and you want to have, emmetropia, you need to have optics that match that. That makes sense. Now, if your cornea is a certain power, then your lens needs to have another power just to match it. High-powered cornea needs to have a low-powered lens and the other way around. Otherwise, emmetropia cannot be there. Now, these are the emmetropes. And you see there is no relationship at all between lens power and corneal power at all. Unless you consider the colors. The colors represent action length. And you see here low-powered optics for long eyes, high-powered optics for short eyes. And you see this gradient here, clear gradient from here to there, or the other way around. That explains the balance. Now the next question is, these are the emmetropes, so where are the ametropes? All the myopes, hypermetropes, where are they? Well, they're right here. They're right underneath. You cannot distinguish the powers based on refractive error alone. It's not possible. You cannot separate them. Now here's another representation that took me a few days to put this together. So here we have a representation of an eye that you will recognize, and here at the bottom you have axial length, so short axial length, long axial length, anterior corneal, the position of the anterior cornea, posterior cornea, anterior lens, posterior lens. This line is the retina, these are the focal points, and here we have the focal point of the cornea. The red ones represent emmetropia, the black ones is the rest of the population. Again, total overlap. And you can appreciate that perhaps a bit more if you cycle through the different refractive groups. You see, and this one I like very much, is how these line up very well. This is, of course, one definition of your refractive error. And you can see very well how that lines up. But you see also here the position of the anterior and posterior cornea, lens. You see, they follow this line very clearly and they stay within this, with this variability. 2 standard deviations, and they stay, regardless of the refractive error, they stay within it. Now, of course, it's not new that there is a massive overlap between refractive errors. The biometry of the refractive errors. These gentlemen have found this already 80, 90 years ago, and Sorsby was in the 50s and 60s, so that's more like 60, 70 years ago. And especially Sorsby made a big deal out of that and said there are 2 types of ametropia. You have correlation ametropia and you have component ametropia. Now, component ametropia, that's the one we're all very familiar with. That is when one parameter, typically axial length, is just way off. And that you could consider axial myopia. There I have no argument with. That's when you have like a -6, -7. Nobody's going to argue that that is a refractive myopia, axial myopia, sorry. But it's this ±4, ±5, where all this overlap happens. There must be something going on with the correlation between the different parameters. But it's not a statistical form of correlation, the correlation that we're all familiar with, you know, in the graph sets, like I showed you just now. Because if you have that kind of statistical correlation, it should be reciprocal. This is refractive error as a function of axial length. This is axial length as a function of refractive error. You see, the graphs are very different, even though all I did was rotate them 90 degrees. These correlations are completely different, so that doesn't really work. Again, this has to do with the bigaussian nature of it. Again, that's another talk. Instead, we should think in terms of shape factors. So this is, again, not a real new concept. This was already considered in the 1960s, and Frank Scheffel reiterated that a bit a number of years ago when discussing chicken eyes. So there are a certain set of parameter ranges that are connected with each other that would define something as a human eye, as opposed to, you know, a mouse eye, a rabbit eye, an elephant eye. Certain combinations just work for human eyes, others just work for mouse eyes. And this was first invented or considered by Gerald van Alphen. He was a Dutch guy that I could not find a picture of. Actually, he wrote a couple of very interesting papers, and I could not find anything else from him. Not even, I had to struggle to find his name even, because it was always G. So, based on all the correlations between parameters, he figured this out, kind of intuitively, all these combinations, how they must work together, and it was pretty accurate. Now, this was, of course, based on feeling and reasoning. He also did principal component analysis. So, this morning, a couple of speakers already mentioned it. It's a way to combine things into an independent basis that could be considered as a shape factor. So, let me show what that looks like. Well, you see a lot of numbers. This doesn't mean all that much to you. So, let's make it a bit more intuitive. These 3 here represent all the components that we need to build this basis, and that if you take 3, then 98% of the variance, the cumulative variances of the model is explained. I can take a 4th one and we're even better, but you know, since we are 3-dimensional beings, I leave it with 3 dimensions for now. So, and then you can make a volume, you know, principal component 1, 2, and 3 here, and for each of these points in that volume, inside that cube represents a possible eye. No matter which one, it's all a possible eye. The more you go towards the corners, the more unrealistic it is, but especially the ones in the center are realistic eyes, for sure. And then you can say, detect for all these eyes, well, what is the refractive error? What is the actual length, corneal power, and the lens power? So that's what these colors represent. Now, perhaps this is still not very realistic or intuitive. I mean, this is perhaps not that intuitive. So let's go to these components one by one. The first component, principal component here, is just, we take 2 and 3 are just chosen 0, and number 1 is just moving between the two extremes. And you see this is the eye that corresponds with it. You see it's just moving forward and backwards. The eye is emmetropic, and as the eye gets shorter and longer, the cornea and the lens go along with it. This is just basically a scale factor. Short eyes, high power, long eyes, low power. That's it. So this is the scale factor. The second one is the principal component that goes in that direction. So PC1, PC3 are 0, the other one is varying. And here you see that the actual length is not moving that much, it's moving a little bit. Again, it's emmetropic. But you see all the action is happening here. The cornea is changing, the lens is changing. This is the power balance. The power balance between the cornea and the lens. When the cornea is weak, the lens has to be powerful, and the other way around. And then the third one, in the vertical direction, so PC1 and 2 are 0. And here, this one here, you can see all kinds of stuff happen, but the focal point is fixed. The focal point doesn't move, but the actual length, and especially here the lens, is doing all kinds of wild things. But this one is the ametropia factor. This one is very, very correlated. It's like 0.9 with refractive error. It's not exactly refractive error, but it's very strongly correlated. Now, with all these tools, we can start thinking about how to define emmetropia. The easiest way that you could try to do that is with correlations, like I did before. So we have an actual length, and we just do regressions of where the different surfaces would be, what the different powers would be, and just make a model such as this. So as this is definitely a perfect emmetropic model for all kinds of actual lengths. The focal point is right here, so it's nice on the retina, exactly where you want it. But based on what you saw a couple of slides ago, all these variations, you feel that there's something missing. This is really just, scaling up. That's just one of the 3 components I showed you. This is what you should be seeing. So, all of these things are possible. These are all possible. So, but how would you describe this? Well, to describe this, you need to describe this green surface. This green surface is describable, relatively easy. It's an equation of a couple of lines, but it's doable. But this is the case for all eyes. So emmetropes, ametropes, all together. And then this, the error that you produce can still be plus or minus 1 diopter. If you really want to have a very accurate model, we need to go further. We need to model only the emmetropes, only people between plus and minus a half diopter, and then we need to go 4-dimensional. So this green surface in 4 dimensions, that one needs to be modeled. And that, I can tell you, is a bit of a nightmare because the expression itself is 30 terms long, and if you want to expand it to its full form, then it's about 5 pages long. So it's not that easy to understand. So my conclusions, I forgot this one here. Another thing was that the uniqueness of eyes. The uniqueness of eyes, I wanted to know, I have 2,000 eyes. So how many of these eyes could be considered eye twins? If you would measure them in your biometer, and you measure another eye with a biometer, could you be mistaken with the repeatability of the machine? Could you be mistaken one eye for the other? And in this case, I could only find 3 pairs. 3 pairs of twins. So eyes are pretty much unique. And they become more unique the more parameters you include. In this case, I included 7. So the take-home message here is that biometric segregation of ametropia is very, very complicated. It's something higher order, something totally overlapping. It all depends on the refractive development. The second thing is there is many ways to be emmetropic as there are emmetropes out there. And there are a lot of emmetropes out there. And finally, there are even more ways to be ametropic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jos. It's a wonderful presentation, very well animated. Thank you. So I wanted to ask you something. So You showed us that there is a lot of variability. One can be an emmetrope by different combinations of all the factors that you showed. But the thing is that I was thinking is that the definition of refractive error can also vary a lot depending on higher order aberrations. What I mean is that when you're saying that I'm comparing myopes of -2, but you don't really know what's behind those -2, because when you refract, you are choosing a lens that maximizes the subjective image quality. But the wavefront of the patient can be completely different. The origin of that -2, one can have a lot of spherical aberration, the other one can have more defocus, almost no spherical aberration. So the Gaussian properties of those eyes can be quite different.
Yeah.
So, and does that introduce some noise in this analysis?
Yes, most definitely. But here I have to repeat what Larry said this morning. This is just a simplified version. Of course, if you measure higher order aberration, wavefronts, corneal topography, then it becomes more of a Zmax model. Which is fine, but it's much harder to understand because a focal point becomes very fuzzy, principal planes become, well...
I know, but my thought was if you introduce an extra parameter where, for instance, you can calculate like a marginal error, you can calculate from the corneal surface, you can infer how different the marginal error is from the central error. Maybe one more parameter could help to reduce a lot of that variance. I don't know.
It could be, but for now this is a fairly simple Peripheral model.
Let's thank our speaker again.
Thank Neil and Matt, and I'll get on to the talk. Okay, well look, I don't have to go any length about myopia becoming an increasing health-wide problem, but it has been something that's been thought about for a while and how we might try and have lenses that might prevent myopia or slow down the progression. And over about the last 10 years, there have been some lenses developed which I'll refer to as multi-segment lenses. And then you have a central region of about 10 millimeters in diameter, and outside that you have spaces, and between the spaces you have positive powered lens slits, and they cover about half the area in which they occur. And the idea of these is that they're meant to produce positive peripheral refraction, and supposedly that will dampen the optical signal for eye growth. Now, two of these lenses are the Hoya MySmart and the Essilor Stellest, and there are others, but I'm just going to talk about those two. I just noticed the pen has got MySmart written on it. Okay, so they do seem to work, and so the studies have shown that they slow axial length growth and myopia progression by about half when they're compared to the growth that you'll get with single vision lenses. However, I would have to say here that, of course, most of the studies that have been done have been industry promoted. That doesn't mean they're wrong, but it would be nice to have some independent ones. Okay, so just a little bit about the Hoya MySmart. This has 1 millimeter diameter lenslets, and they're arranged in 9 hexagons. And each lenslet is surrounded by 6 neighbours. This is a polycarbonate lens, naturally. And all the base curve is just 3 diopters regardless of power. The lenslets start about 6 millimeters away from the centre and then gradually get further out to the 9th one. The power of the lenslets is 4 diopters, and they also have a degree of negative asphericity, so the power is greatest in the middle and then drops off a little bit. Then we have the Essilor lens, which is a bit of a different beast. Now the lenslets are arranged in rings, and there are 11 of these rings, and the adjacent lenslets are just touching. Like Hoya, it's made of polycarbonate, and the base curve is almost exactly the same. And the centre area gives you about 12 millimetres, or I suppose a bit less than that. And the inner 5 rings have approximately 10 diopters in power, and they do have a lot of negative asphericity, and Essilor make a big deal about that. And outside that, the power of the lenslets gradually reduces. Now, there have been many studies, or there have been a few studies on optical performance and image quality with these lenses, but when these are done, the light is always incident normally. And as far as I am aware, there aren't any investigations of the more natural situations that occur, in which light will be incident obliquely at the lenses. And this will occur in peripheral vision, and then, of course, that's what you want, because you want the kids who are wearing these to look straight through the centres of the lenses and be affected by the periphery. But of course, you might expect them going to rotate their eyes around a little bit. So another oblique consideration would be foveal vision, in which the eye rotates to look through the lens periphery. And that's what this study is about. So it's a theoretical investigation of these refractions. A little bit about methods. I did look at different powers, but just for the sake of this talk here, the powers will be -4Ds. And we've modelled the front surfaces using a particular type of surface called the array ring surface type, which is part of ZMAX software. I put these lenses behind a Model I, which is my own, and it's a refraction dependent Model I, so of course this has been set up for 4 Doctors myopia. The anterior cornea is 12 millimetres away from the back surface of the lens, and the centre of rotation of the eye is 27 millimetres away from the back surface of the lens. So I've worked out the relevant powers of the lens, both tangential and sagittal powers, and these have been determined for the static eye situation in peripheral vision and the foveal situation with rotating eye. Okay, and just a bit more diagram to show these static cases and rotating cases. So on the left, I'm just showing an eye that's combined with a Hoyer lens, and you see ray beams both centrally and peripherally, and in the peripherally, you're looking through the third hexagon. So this is just out at 32.5 degrees. If you switch over to the right-hand side diagram, now you've got the eye rotating by 31.6 degrees, so it's looking to look at an object of interest off the centre of the lens, and you're now looking through the 8th hexagon, so that's the second last hexagon. Okay, let's go through some results, and we'll do the Hoyer lens first, and then the Essilor lens. Firstly, this is showing corrections across the vertical visual field. So I must emphasise what I'm showing you are corrections. So if you've got a lens that's 4 diopters in power and you're correcting that, then the correction is about -4 diopters. So anyway, you can see away from the axis that the powers really get very high. There's a little bit of, if you just look at the distance part of the lenses, so that's the bit without the big dips, then you've got overall you've got a slightly negative power out into the periphery. If we look at 32.5 degrees, that's just there, then this is the correction that we've got there. So we've got a -4 diopter sphere with a -3 diopter 6 cylinder. So that's a really big power, and you see that if you just take the average of that and get -6, then that's way beyond the 4 diopters that the lens hood is supposed to be. And what I've just done on the bottom line, I've indicated what that is relative to the distance correction. This is another representation where I'm out in the periphery looking through that third hexagon, and I'm just working out across a large pupil of about 5 millimetres the tangential and sagittal powers. I don't want to go through the explanation of this because that'll take up the rest of my time, but if you just look at this diagram towards the bottom there, just showing the tangential powers, and maybe we'll just concentrate on what happens vertically, you can see that there's some really big effects here, and there's sort of there's a sort of gradation from top. That's the top of the pupil, that's the bottom of the pupil, and you just get some incredibly big effects here, like particularly here, that's right at the top of the lens, and these powers just go crazy there. Finally, for the Hoyer lens, I'd just like to show you what happens with the rotating eye. So again, this is the correction. Now, for foveal vision, the actual correction for just the distance part of the lens is very good. So you see these are practically nothing. But of course you do get a lot of power through the segment, and the power's increased as you get away from the centre. So if we're looking here through the 8th hexagon, this is the power that we've got. We've got a -4 diopter, a 4.8 diopter sphere, and a -0.7 diopter cylinder. Nothing like the cylindrical effects we were getting with the stationary eye. Okay, well, just a couple of slides on the SLR lens. And really it looks very much like the Hoya, just a little bit exaggerated, because the power of the SLR lenses in their lenses are much bigger. Instead of being -4 in the middle, instead of a lens that's having a power of +4, the powers are +6. So of course that means the corrections and the astigmatisms are a little bit higher. I'll jump over looking at what goes along across the pupil in peripheral vision and just show you the corrections for the rotating eye. Initially the picture is somewhat similar to what you get for the Hoya lens. You expect them to be fairly similar because the actual angle that I'm looking through here is the same as I was showing you through for the Hoya. So the correction is fairly good for the distance part of the lens, and then of course through the segments we get much greater corrections, and they're bigger than they are for the Hoya lenses because the powers are bigger. And then you can see that these powers actually, the corrections aren't quite as negative once you go beyond about 32 degrees, and that's because, as I told you before, the lenslet's powers actually reduce in the 6th ring and beyond. Okay, well that's pretty well it. And I'm going to make, which might be a bit provocative, and say that the peripheral optics associated with these lenses are pretty terrible, particularly in the case of peripheral vision, which of course doesn't mean they don't work. And these lenses have effective powers in the periphery, which is much higher than the specified powers, and that's done both across the field and also across the pupil at a particular field location. And there's a heck of a lot of astigmatism there. The effects that you see are much greater for peripheral vision than for the rotating eye, and all of this is because of the obliquity of rays through the lenses. Now, I don't really know how all this interacts with the successful treatment of myopia, but I just thought the optics should have been looked at. Now, what I'm going to just do next in the future is to look at some of the other lenses. There's a very interesting one with the Zeiss lens, which actually the additions are in the form of cylinders. So there's all these little cylinders going around the lens, which have a cylindrical power of 9 diopters. And of course, if you apply my treatment, that cylinder will actually even be higher than that. And if you're interested, then there's just a series of references at the end. And thank you very much, and sorry for my voice.
Hello, thank you for the very interesting talk. So I work for SLR, but I have to say that
Where are you? I'm sorry. Thank you.
I have not been involved in the design of these products. So I'm curious to know if you have looked at the chromatic aberrations at these angles for both the Hoya and the SLR products.
That's quite topical given our lens talk. No, I haven't. I mean, that would be... I've got to get all this stuff sorted out first, and that could be well worth looking at. You would expect that these lenses could have a lot of high transverse chromatic aberration because, of course, they are, for a start, they're made of polycarbonate, which has a very low V value.
Exactly, but I guess that you imply that the effects that you have observed might have a positive or a negative impact on slowing myopia. We don't know yet.
No, we don't know. No.
And maybe this is what makes them work.
Could be. They definitely obviously work.
Thank you.
David, Ray Applegate here.
I remember you.
Yes, you remember. Okay, so I've talked to several clinicians, and most of them come to the conclusion that myopia can be slowed by overpowering the optics anyway. And it really doesn't matter how you do it, but I've always been puzzled about providing bad optics to children to begin with, and I wonder if you have any thoughts on it. Is overcoming myopia or slowing myopia, is it going to be slowed enough to overcome the potential deficits of myopic disease, or is the bad optics going to alter the perception of the child significantly?
Well, I don't really know a lot, but I suppose if you could slow down the growth of myopia, so maybe somebody would end up being 2 doctors myopic less than they would be otherwise, that would probably be a good thing. I mean, if you're a 6 doctor myope, you're much more likely to have problems later in life than a 4 doctor myope.
Right, but has anybody looked at the optical consequences to perception over time of having kids in these lenses?
Not that I'm aware. I would just like to point out, I mean, my theory is, and it's really only half-baked, that if you have some good vision combined with poor vision, that's what does it. And I think of that also because there's a Chinese group recently that's come out with a new lens, and this lens actually has negative lens-look powers. So they did a trial on the lens with minus 3 diopter ads, and compared that with lenses with plus 3 diopter ads. And they got exactly the same reduction in progression.
We have time for one question.
Hi, David.
Hi, Linda.
But anyway, no, it works. Thank you. I would like to ask you, we actually did a small case study on peripheral vision through the myopia control with only 3 subjects. But there was one thing that I would like to ask you that we saw. I mean, of course, we saw a decrease in contrast sensitivity for both of these spectral designs. But they were quite different in kind of the impression when you looked through them. Because the stellids were flickering a bit more when you moved around. You got a flickering experience when you moved around compared to the Hoya. And I'm wondering if you have seen something like that in your simulations. Have you seen something like that you get a faster variation in the image quality with one of them if you change the angle?
I'm not quite sure what the question is, but of course I've sort of done it either. It's peripheral vision or it's central vision. And of course you're not going to expect the kids are going to just keep on looking right through the central lenses. So there may be other cues that they pick up because they are going to move their eyes around a little bit. Is that any help to what you were saying? Yeah. But I don't know. This has sort of been, it's this or that, and obviously it's going to be, in real life it's going to be a lot more complicated than that.
Let's welcome our next. So I've just been given a very great introduction to the topic of myopia among multiple speakers. Thank you for that. The study that I've been involved with is focused on trying to understand optical reasons for the development or the progression of myopia in kids. And this is because of the growing global health problem, with over 50% estimated to be nearsighted by the end of 2050. The 2 things that we are focused on in this work revolves around near work, which Mehrjoo talked a lot about, which is correlated with the myopia development. And additionally, we're also investigating how peripheral image quality is involved in all of this, since in these new spectacles and also contact lenses, the peripheral image quality is a huge focus in the design of these new myopia control therapies. So, a quick recap of RPR, which has already been mentioned today, is it's called a relative peripheral refraction, which is basically you look at how the refraction in the periphery differs from the refraction in the fovea. So you can be relatively myopic in the periphery, and that is the same as having a negative RPR, or you could be relatively hypermetropic in the periphery, and that is the same as having a positive RPR. And the theory is, which is confirmed with some animal studies, is that then if you have a relatively negative RPR, that will signal to the eye that, hey, you're long enough, stop growing. But if you don't have that signal, then that could allow for the eye to grow more in simplified terms. The question that we've been investigating in this work is whether accommodation itself affects RPR. So, because if we think that knee work itself leads to myopia progression, and RPR itself could influence myopia progression, are these two correlated? And more specifically, does knee work accommodation induce a more positive RPR in children? So imagine you do knee work, maybe then the RPR moves, becomes more positive, moves back, and that could indicate or point us in the direction of why knee work in that sense induces or accelerates myopia progression. So the study that I've been involved with is part of a larger study, which is the Stockholm myopia study, which was just launched last year. So it is a longitudinal study where we measure kids and we follow them once per year for up to 8 years. And the results that I'm presenting today are part of the baseline results that have been measured during the past year. The peripheral image quality has been measured with and without accommodation, and this is the main focus on my work here. We primarily measure children that are about 6 to 9 years old at baseline, and then we will follow them as they age. And they should have no visual or eye-related issues apart from refractive errors at baseline. So, in order to measure peripheral image quality with accommodation, we have a custom-built dual-angle wavefront sensor. So it's a wavefront sensor which has two wavefront sensors, so we can measure two visual fields at the same time. We choose to measure foveal and either 25 degrees horizontally, then nasally, or temporally at the same time. So the kids fixate binocularly through a hot mirror on fixation targets, either placed 4.5 meters away or 20 centimeters away. And then either to the left side or right side, depending on whether we want to measure the nasal or the temporal visual field. And since it's simultaneous wavefront measurements, we can then immediately see what is the accommodative state foveally, and then what was the peripheral refraction at the same time. And from that, we can then calculate RPR very accurately. So apart from this, we do eye examination tests and vision tests just to check that they have healthy eyes and fall within the inclusion criteria. We do cycloplegic autorefraction to check their refractive state, and also measure acceleration, as well as some other things. And now on to the results section. So these are just some of the baseline values to give you a sense of the population so far. So we measured 34 children successfully. Most of them were about 7 years old, and the vast majority were slightly hypermetropic. And most also had axial length about 22 to 23 millimeters. Now on to relative peripheral refraction. So what you see here, I hope you can see the plots all right on the screen, is RPR in the temporal visual field, RPR in the nasal visual field, and these are just now the values for the far measurements when they look at the targets that are 4.5 meters away. And they are sorted, each dot here is one kid. The median values we got for one kid, or for each kid. And they're sorted in ascending order, just to give you a sense of the spread, so to say. And we can see here on the y-axis we have RPR with positive RPR above the line, negative RPR beneath the line. So myopic RPR over here, positive over here. So you see most kids have negative relative peripheral refraction, both nasally and foveally, when they look at far at the baseline measurements. And these are scaled to 4 millimeter pupils, I should say. Then, the interesting thing is what happens then when they accommodate. to the near target. So if we just add on top of this the results for the near measurements, the most striking feature, I think, is that in the nasal visual field, generally, RPR becomes more negative. We get more myopic RPR when the kids accommodate compared to when they don't in the nasal visual field. In the temporal visual field, it's a little bit difficult to see maybe in this graph, but the trend is actually the opposite. Most kids get a slightly more positive RPR, slightly more hypermetropic RPR in the temporal visual field. And this should be with about 5 diopters of accommodation. However, there can be some needle lag, so I've also decided to plot this as accommodation change, so the foveal refraction, near versus far, and here is the RPR change. So basically, if we look at, for each kid, how much did the RPR change when they accommodated? And we plot that change versus how much they actually accommodated. Then we get this graph. And most kids, though there are some outliers, get more negative, like I said, RPR in the nasal visual field. Most kids also accommodate almost 5 diopters. They should accommodate 4.8 if they have no needle lag. Whereas temporally, we get a slightly more positive relative peripheral refraction. And the values here are the median values for the difference between RPR at near and far. So about 0.05 diopters more positive temporally, and minus 0.42 diopters more negative nasally. So the big question is how this then relates to myopia development. And before I go into that, then I just want to illustrate this in terms of fish human eye again, just to remind you that this then means that nasally, when we get a more negative RPR, that means that the image moves more in front of the retina. And in the temporal visual field, what we saw was that for most kids, the image moves slightly more behind the retina. But of course, whether the image actually ends up on, in front, or behind the retina depends on if they have any needle lag and whether the RPR is positive or negative from the start. So we can't be sure that when they accommodate, they end up getting an image in front of the retina or oppositely. So just to remind you of that this is a very simplified view. But the interesting thing is then, from the start, our hypothesis would be that accommodation would produce something like this, that we get a more hypermetropic RPR in the periphery. And that we see temporarily, although only just slightly, whereas nasally we get the opposite effect. So if near work, accommodation, and RPR are linked in their effect on myopia progression, that would indicate that it is the temporal visual field mainly that affects myopia development. Whereas in the nasal visual field, we see the opposite happening. So to sum up this presentation, this is just the baseline work. We will investigate, of course, longitudinally what happens to these kids and what happens when they grow, and depending on how their relative refraction was in the beginning and so on. I'm looking forward very much to doing that analysis. Then most kids at baseline were slightly hypermetropic. Most have already had negative RPRs, both nasally and temporally. Most kids got a more hypermetropic, that is a more positive RPR in the temporal visual field when they accommodated. And the opposite happened, that they got a more myopic negative RPR in the nasal visual field with accommodation. And this then could indicate that it is the temporal visual field that is more important for the eye to regulate myopia development, or myopia progression, emmetropization. And also I want to give a quick shout out to my colleague Rebecca's poster, which has done similar analysis on between emmetropic and myopic adults. So check that out tomorrow. Thank you so much.
Thank you so
much. Questions?
Thank you very much for an interesting presentation. You said that you had more than 30 successfully measured children.
Yes.
Does it mean that there were any unsuccessful measurements, and could they alter the results? What was the reason?
Yeah, the unsuccessful measurements were mostly to do with kids that had trouble concentrating. So in this instrument, the dual angle instrument, they need to sit still, look at first one target and then the next one, and some kids just couldn't do that. So that's one reason, some were excluded. Another reason is because of the scaling to 4 millimeters. So some kids that have pupils smaller than 4 millimeters are not showing these graphs. So depending on if you choose to scale everything to 4 millimeters or whether you scale just 3 millimeters or something, then you might get a few more kids.
So what was the total number of children, more or less?
We measured 38 kids so far.
38, so 4 were excluded?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, I think I was second, but anyway, it's here. It's a very nice work, and it's a little bit surprising what you are showing between the nasal and temporal side, and that's an interesting effect. And I'm just wondering whether you also collect biometric data on those kids.
Yes.
And are you looking also at the lens tilt?
Are we what?
Lens tilt.
So we do measure with the eye star, so from the new ISO instrument, and then you get corneal topography, and I think you can extract lens tilt, but I'm not.
Okay, because if you use, let's say, IOL master, you would get a picture of the lens as well.
Yeah, you can
probably,
see that.
Get a little bit of an estimate from that of the maybe the tilt of the lens is the culprit. Huh? Culprit. Yeah. That just a picture.
Yes, thank you.
I have a question. I'll already have it. Is there any indication that there was a difference in accommodative lag in the two stimulus conditions of 0 Dopplers of demand and whatever 4 Dopplers of demand?
Nasal or temporal, or so there's a very slight tendency, because usually we do we start with the measurements for the temporal vision field. So they look at the left targets and then the right targets, and there is a slight tendency that they get a little bit tired. So sometimes the accommodation is a little bit less when we do the nasal target versus the left side target. So that is, but the difference is not large. It's maybe 0. It's a fraction of a diopter. It's not a lot.
You're defining refractive error how from the wavefront measure?
Yeah, we're just looking at focus now. Sorry, I forgot to say
just
that. Yeah, just to focus. And of course, we can do with other terms as well. We have wavefront data. For now, this is just with the first order.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you very much. This is super interesting. Just very short. Did you look at the dependence of measurements on age as well? Because it was quite a large age range.
Yeah, so we have not looked extensively into the difference in the age groups yet. As you can see, there are some outliers here. We just have one kid that's a little more less, the rest are maybe between 6 and 9 years old. So we've not looked at that difference yet, no.
I wanted to ask something that I already asked, which is related to the definition of refractive error. So we already mentioned that you only use the defocus term.
Yes.
But those lenses that you are using are those segmented lenses, right? So the lenses from the study are segmented lenses.
Oh, they're not. They're only wearing their habitual correction. They're not wearing these lenses.
Oh, okay.
So most kids don't have any glasses on at all.
Okay.
And those that do have their habitual correction. Yes.
Let's thank Charlie again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Angelina and organizers. This is one of my favorite meetings. I much prefer small groups. Okay, so we're talking about wavefront-guided scleral contact lens corrections for the keratoconic eye. Wavefront-guided corrections for the highly aberrated eye are beginning to translate from the laboratory into clinical practice. And as with any such transitions, are at risk of getting a bad name for the typical reasons. A rush to profit prior to understanding the differences and challenges between what is required in the laboratory and what's successful in clinical practice. And clinicians, I'm finding lack basic knowledge of wavefront error, wavefront measurement, wavefront correction, and the associated optical principles. And that's important for many reasons. The main one is that such knowledge allows clinicians to better demand the industry provide efficient and effective clinical instrumentation. If you don't understand the problem, you're just trusting the instrument to do what it says that it's going to do. Okay, and a failure of lens manufacturers to specify the accuracy and precision with which the lens is manufactured. Not only the aberration structure, but the placement on the lens. It's got to be aligned with the underlying refractive error or refractive errors based on the aberration structure. So the lenses work. I don't want you to get any impression that they don't work if it's done well. And here you see measurements made with patients, keratoconic patients wearing a habitual correction, and then with a standard conventional lens, that's spherocylindrical conventional lens. And you can see it reduces the distribution down a lot. But if you put a wavefront-guided lens, you can see they're all converging towards the normal range. I want to point out, though, that just looking at the higher order RMS wavefront error is misleading. You need to look at a visual index, something that measures the visual image quality. And if you look at these same eyes and compare it to the normal range of a best correction, very few eyes are actually getting there. But again, I want to emphasize the patients are very happy. Many of them saying they've never seen so well in 20, sometimes 30 years. So the basic principles for creating a wavefront-guided correction have been discussed in the literature. There are several papers out there. However, the overviews skirt the practical clinical practice needs for success. So I'm going to focus more on those. Here are the purposes to discuss practical clinical needs. So clinical needs include clinicians must want to provide better vision for their unsatisfied patients. Poor clinical education in both basic optics and understanding visual optics. And it's true both in ophthalmology and optometry. I work in optometry. Understanding the visual image quality as opposed to the traditional ophthalmic measures of retinal image quality. You don't need images better than the retina can actually process. And manufacturing accuracy and precision, and clinical aberrometer design. So let's talk about clinicians and the need to provide better vision for their unsatisfied patients. The excessive level of residual higher order aberrations present while wearing a spherocylindrical scleral contact lens and the resulting patient dissatisfaction have been known for years. And there's numerous publications, and here's just a few of them. Clinicians must reject the notion that masking some of the aberrations using a rigid contact lens to index match is good enough, or worse yet, saying that's all that can be done. That's not true anymore. All right, poor clinical education of both basic optics and visual optics. In clinical education, optical principles, after introducing Snell laws, are taught using periaxial optical approach. Now, nothing against the periaxial approach. It works wonderful for the normal patient. However, for the abnormal patient, ignoring the clinical utility of a wavefront approach is not meeting the needs of some of your patients. Little attention is paid to skew rays and their impact on visual image quality, or that the main problem in transferring spatial information optically to the eye's neural system are phase errors as opposed to reduced contrast. Reduced contrast, if there's no contrast, obviously, it doesn't work, but usually there's more than enough contrast, and it's the phase errors that are making the visual problem. And this is illustrated easily here in this figure that Larry Titus made a long time ago for book publication. If you notice, the top has both the phase and contrast errors, but if you just correct the phase errors, notice that you can read many more letters across at the bottom. Importantly, basic understanding of wavefront optics, the point spread function, and a bit of Fourier optics, and how the neural system processes spatial information will place the clinician in a position of knowledge to demand better for their patients and to the industry that's providing the instrumentation. Educational leaders need to embrace the need to change how optical principles and visual optics are taught, both in optometry and ophthalmology. Understanding visual image quality as opposed to traditional ophthalmic measures of retinal image quality. The most commonly used ophthalmic metric of retinal image quality, as opposed to visual image quality, is RMS wavefront error. Neither high-order RMS wavefront error or total RMS wavefront error are particularly good metrics for visual image quality. Certainly there's a relationship, I don't want to imply that. Neither high-order RMS wavefront error or total RMS wavefront error consider how the neural system processes the spatial information. When using high-order RMS wavefront error for a fixed pupil diameter, the assumption is high-order aberrations are visually independent of low-order aberrations of serum cylinder. They're absolutely not. Using total RMS wavefront error assumes a decrease in the total RMS wavefront error will increase visual image quality. This assumption is also false. Each individual aberration impacts visual image quality differently, and individual terms interact with other terms to increase or decrease visual image quality and resulting visual performance. Consequently, increasing a high-order RMS wavefront error or total RMS wavefront error can increase, decrease, or leave the visual image quality the same. Visual image quality metrics, as opposed to retinal image quality metrics consider both the retinal image input to the neural system as well as how the visual system processes the information. The visual scroll ratio calculated in the spatial domain is better correlated to visual measures of visual performance such as acuity than our RMS wavefront error. And the key reason for this is it's designed to be sensitive to phase shifts and respect elements of neural contrast sensitivity processing and photoreceptor sampling. The visual scroll is more sensitive to quantifying changes in blur regardless of the type of aberration present and their interactions, and high contrast acuity is demonstrated by Ravi Kumar. The visual scroll is independent of pupil size and underlying wavefront error, and provides the clinician an objective metric for evaluating patients who say, yes, my acuity may be the same, but my vision is not as good. And this was found often in the refractive surgery industry early in its development. Manufacturing accuracy and precision. Unlike spherocylindrical contact lenses, there are no standards for the accuracy and precision in manufacturing of a Wavefront-Guided patch or its placement on the contact lens. It has to be registered with the underlying wavefront error. This is unacceptable. Standards need to be set, preferably based on the anticipated gain in visual image quality provided by the actual manufactured lens, assuming an otherwise healthy eye
and well-aligned optics. With the advent of AI, artificial intelligence, and fast computers, standards do not have to be set and cast in stone. Instead, they can respect many variables, including the age of the patient, the severity of the aberrations, and the measured movement of the lens, with the goal to return visual image quality for the patient to the normal range for their age. Clinical aberrometer design. This is probably the biggest problem in the field right now. Clinical aberrometers for fitting wavefront-guided scleral lenses are improving, and as more demand is generated, more improvements will be made. Features for the ideal wavefront sensor for fitting a wavefront-guided lens includes high density sampling. You've got to make sure that you've measured the actual wavefront error that's there. If you undersample, you're not sure at all. And it needs to have a dynamic range capable of accurately and precisely measuring the complex wavefront errors that result, say, from a bomb blast injury to the cornea. Fitting the measured wavefront error with a Zernike polynomial smooths the wavefront error that's actually underneath the measured wavefront error. So high density sampling allows for significant oversampling, which in turn allows for the Zernike error fit to be determined. If the Zernike error fit error is large, an alternative approach for designing the correction should be used, like using the actual data. The allowable movement varies obviously with the magnitude of the error, and I try to illustrate this in the following figure. If you have movement of the contact lens in a highly aberrated eye, that's on the right, it's advancing on its own, you can see that there's very little movement that can occur in a more highly aberrated eye than a normal eye. But if the translation is less than 0.2 millimeters, you can expect to gain a lot in the normal eye and significantly higher in an aberrated eye. So proper alignment requires the fixation point to be on the optical axis of the aberrometer, and that the optical axis of the aberrometer is aligned to the center of the fixating eye's dilated pupil. This is important because you want the eye rotated into the position you want it. And right now, aberrometers aren't really carefully controlling how the eye is rotated at the time of measurement, other than to have the eye fixating. The same problem exists in corneal topography. Generally, you align to the Purkinje image in corneal topography, and that is rarely in the center of the pupil, so all of the values you measure in the corneal topographer is not along the line of sight. Multiple measurements. You need to make several multiple measurements after a blink. It should be automatically done using AI to select the best set of measurements for both the wavefront error and the location of the contact lens center with respect to the pupil center, so that the patch will be placed in the right position. And given the need for lens stability for a beneficial improvement in visual image quality, and that it varies with the severity of the wavefront error, the aberrometer needs to estimate using gathered information whether the gain in visual image quality is likely to provide a significant benefit to the patient. In addition to the one I just mentioned, the aberrometer needs to determine if the variation in visual image quality due to the small movements is too large, and a modified wavefront correction is needed to provide benefit to the patient. The aberrometer needs to be able to transmit data and receive data directly from the lens manufacturer in a manner that respects all relevant healthcare laws. Perhaps most importantly, the aberrometer has to be organized, the software, to be easy to use in the clinical environment. Currently, that's not the case. Stepping the user through the data collection quickly and efficiently with data analysis occurring seamlessly in the background. And I thank you for your attention.
We have time for one question.
thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. I'm a physicist, so the wavefront analysis, I work in optics for many years, so it's very, very nice to have the opportunity to listen to that. But what kind of wavefront measurements do you think of? Because there are maybe two different techniques, I think, that can be used. It is interferometric methods, which are probably more difficult to implement to get it cheap, and Hartmann-Shack aberrometer. And I think that most of the even laboratory aberrometers, Hartmann-Shack aberrometers, have quite big area of analysis. And I think that the limit, I know the limit of this aberrometer because a group of my colleagues from University of Warsaw developed the world's smallest Hartmann-Shack sensor with lenses of size of diameter of less than 20 microns. Okay, and the whole area is smaller than 1 millimeter, but the area can be made bigger, but the size of the lenses could be less than 20 microns. But there are still difficulties with using such technology, because if we go into such big data science, because we get a lot of information from one measurement which must be scanned, because the size of the sensor is very small, we can probably get into mathematical or digital troubles analyzing this data and trying to compare them with, for example, Zernicke polynomials. Could you comment on that, or what kind of method we should use to get good results?
I can tell you what we use, and I've compared a couple different aberrometers. Dan Neal's instrumentation from waveguide. In that sample, each lenslet is on the order just a little bit larger than 1/10 of a millimeter. Okay, so we have about, I don't know, it depends on the size of the pupil, but around 1,000 data points to use. The most significant thing we've noticed is that if the data is not well fit by the Zernicke polynomial, then you shouldn't use the Zernicke polynomial. It's not a good representation of the data. And that occurs in very, very highly aberrated eyes. For the most part, the fit has allowed us to design a correction that would return visual image quality to normal levels or above normal levels, quite above normal levels, in fact. But the problem is those lenses are hard to make. So I would put almost all the problem not on the wavefront error measurement if you're using a high density Shack-Hartmann aberrometer. I'd put it on the manufacture of the lens. And that's one thing we just don't have good feedback on. I hope that helps you. I spent a lot of my early years really concerned about how each spot was being analyzed, right? And whether the center was right. But that's trivial in these very highly aberrated eyes. If you get it close, they're going to see better. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Let's think right again.
Dr. Titus, you have a corner next to you. You can ask your question.
I have a question also, but let's do it later.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone. So, it's Masoud from Schönhauer Solution. I'm glad to present one of our random projects to you for this very lovely conference. Since early morning, we are hearing about the Zernicke polynomials, wavefront error, and also the country that I came from by Jos. This will make my presenter much easier. So indeed, I start from a very basic, and I'm heading down to low basic, and see how much those basic changes will change the advancement. But following the race presentation, there are two questions that brought us to this presentation. First of all, the clinician would understand the wavefront error, and also point spread function to be explained pretty well. And also considering the fact that image quality is, when looking at the constant pupil size, it's not only from the low order or high order, but contributing to each other, it should be taken to account. But very basic starting, So on the 19th century, it was a quest to translate the vision into the mathematics. And since then, the first pioneer, a Dutch scientist, was to introduce the zodiac polynomials, which based on that, we can understand or we can mathematically describe what is how the vision is changed based on different aberrations. And accordingly, different method of wavefront measurement was invented as Sharp-Hartman wavefront sensor, also pyramidal wavefront sensor, that we could have access to wavefront and translate wavefront to zodiac polynomial and understand the contribution of each aberration that makes the vision imperfect. Getting one step higher, because only the zodiac polynomial cannot describe the visual perception. Another method or another mathematical response should come to effect, which is point spread function, which indeed describes the visual perception of the patient. So it is so-called response and optical system. So considering the zodiac polynomial, the order below and third are conventionally called low order spectacle correction, and the higher order, which are typically subject for correcting with refractive surgeries with femtosecond or excimer lasers. And then there are a couple of measures that one can explain from the refraction or wavefront alone, of course combined with other log MR, and from that, with the response function, one can understand the Snellen chart and describe the patient perception. But since a few years ago, problems arose to interpret the patient visual perception. Having all machinery tools, it would expect that we can interpret the patient from the diagnostic to post-operative refractive surgery. But a young patient with keratoconus, with a severe keratoconus, the wavefront being measured, and surprisingly, although the patient shows a phase advance, a tilt in positive direction, one may observe a negative tilt in the zodiac polynomial, which, as Ray pointed out, is the effective combination of the high order and low order. So, and the Comash for the severe keratoconus, it should be higher than what we actually observe in the zodiac. On the other hand, a young patient after a refractive surgery came to clinic claiming that he's emmetropic, his day visual perception is pretty good, and he has suffering from a very mild halos all-night vision. But looking at the higher order aberration response or higher order aberration point spread function, it doesn't seem the patient has a metropic situation after the refractive surgery. Even looking at the wavefront, a patient went through a refractive surgery seems to have two diode, still myopic refraction correction, which may confuse clinician. What happens after refractive surgery? We're still saying two diode myopic correction, and the patient went through the myopic corrections field. So you may design a refractive or plan a refractive correction surgery once more, and the patient end up with a no uncorrected refraction. So now the question is, where does this misinterpretation or incomplete interpretation coming from for the diagnostic level? Looking once more to the zodiac polynomial, one can recognize that terms like linear and parabolic from the low order zodiac are actually contributing to high order, meaning that in zodiac space you always should zodiac space brings you to the state of compensate and compromise, because when changing one channel low order, you may get the amplification of the high order, or changing the high order may change the low order, so you are always in a state of compensate compromise. So in order to get a new wavefront, a new definition of wavefront, which is actually independent of low order and high order, one can collect all the low order terms, quadratic, parabolic, linear, and all piston constant terms from the high orders, and redefine the higher order function. It means we actually get all the row square, row 1, row 0 from the higher orders. We apply the normalization to those, and then we get to the Gram-Schmidt and orthogonize all of them. So the new function, which is currently in the community called Gatil mallet, reads as GM. As you can see, for example, the spherical aberration term is now free of the parabolic term, which is main defocus term in the lower order, and also the comma term is free of tilt here now. So it means the word of spectacle has been separated from the word that we have from the high degree. Indeed, looking at the distribution of the higher order in Gatil mallet, so here for the Zernike, in the fourth order, you would see some astigmatism log pattern within the fourth order, but in the Gatil mallet situation, those distributions are out. One more important point is in both space, we describe the same phenomenon. The ideology behind that is to look at the same phenomenon with different perspectives. So indeed, the wavefront does not change. The wavefront is as it is. The way that we interpret the wavefront and we give the weight to each polynomial describing that differs. But in this situation, when we have really a separation, a big wall between the low degree and high degree, what happens is mathematically the zero polynomials low and high order are not the xy space that we all face x, y, z. They are orthonormal, meaning they have nothing to do with each other. So considering the Zernike, low order and high order Zernike are x, y. They are orthogonal. But in this new situation, the low degree and high degree are not anymore orthogonal, meaning that assuming the situation we are in the world that x and y are not independent of each other. They are actually called covariant in mathematics. So those new functions are orthogonal within the subgroup, but looking at the group-to-group, intergroup, they are non-orthogonal. And the conventional mathematics now will change, because for Zernike, everything is orthogonal. You expand a wavefront to the polynomials. Now the polynomials are not anymore orthogonal. Now the quest is how to, when introducing the polynomials, that they can describe high and low, but how we can now distribute actually ways to depth, and they are mathematically broken. When I got the idea to solve this problem when looking at the Dye's first publication about the converting Zernike coefficient for different pupil size. Looking at his publication, he expanded the wavefront for different size in terms of radial and azimuthal, in putting those terms, since we are describing the same, if you consider the radial and azimuthal same in both sides of the conversion, you get to the series of linear equation, and he could end up with a closed form solution. Now we're doing the same. So if we describe the wavefront in both Gatil mallet and the Zernike, expanding both sides in terms of the similar contribution of radial and azimuthal, we ended up with a huge system of inhomogeneous linear equation, and then we can bring them to a matrix format, and this matrix format can be solved. So instead of actually following a new mathematics, we convert all the data that has been already measured without losing the former data and converting them to the new wavefront space that may describe the patient situation better. And now, looking at what happens on the interpretation of the former patient. So back to the patient that went to the myopic refractive treatment. So now, expressing his situation on the Gatil mallet, one can infer that his defocus term is very close to zero, as he was explaining. He is emmetropic, his vision, day vision is pretty good, and as the spherical aberrations, the order spread function of the patient for the higher order aberration, you might see here the contribution of the the contribution of still defocus term in the spherical aberration, but here since those contribution of R parabolic, R squared is gone, you only see the effect of the coma terms in there, which is expected, and then this actually brings us from again another perception vision that we changed with the retinal mallet, and the patient was happier with the right one rather than the left one, which has contribution of the parabolic term. And interestingly, when we're considering the eye as a dynamic ambience, the pupil size changing. So what is desirable to get a perception from clinician without changing the pupil size? If the point spread function is highly subject of pupil size change, the level of understanding may change. You always need to get to the logic to understand, because you lose the information in the point spread function. Now looking at the point spread function with different size in that here, the higher order point spread function for 5 mm and 7 mm pupil size, one may recognize that in retinal mallet space, the point spread function was better preserved rather than the zerity. So it means the information loss between the point spread function of smaller pupil higher than when checking the retinal mallet. The point is that we have a pronounced term rather than the contribution of the terms. Because of that, the pronounced term was preserved through the reducing pupil as well. Also, when changing the pupil size from 3 mm to 6 to 7, what is preserved better is actually the optical power. Considering only the defocus term in both space, Z20 or GM20, and then pupil size. So one can define the optical cover as those terms per square root of the pupil size, and then considering of the value, so you see the optical cover, or a definition of optical cover is better preserved. So we went one more. Yeah, and also, yes, the point is that the spherical cover, spherical aberration was also contributing more into the zerity, which was the case for broadening of the point spread function when we present in the zerotic polynomials. Yes, this was actually a collaboration work between Shirin, R&D, me, and Sam, who was initiating the collaboration with our colleague at Rothschild University, Damien Gatineau and Jacques Mallet. Damien is an ophthalmologist, Jacques is a well-known mathematician in France. So summarizing the idea was that we were trying to answer the question how we can separate, exclude rigidly the low order and high order aberration, now currently called as retinal mallet, low degree, high degree, where the higher order and lower order are separated. And then this may better recognize the aberrations and interpretation of the point spread function. So this is a bidirectional approach, meaning that we can transfer from the retinal mallet to the zerity, and zerity to retinal mallet. So one advantage is we can transfer or convert all the measured data clinically and bring back to the new defined retinal mallet space and see how we can interpret the coefficient, and also how we can associate them with the given interpretation. GM or the retinal mallet may better describe the diagnostic of post-operative as was shown for one of the patients, and there are many of them that we went through the study and saw the correlation, so to say, correlation between them. And point spread function is better preserved by pupil size change in the retinal mallet space rather than zerity. One point is that the new definition of retinal mallet might only find a way in ophthalmology where the value of coefficient matters. For example, in adaptive optics, the compensation matters, not the exact values. You really use the compensation such that you get your optics aligned rather than taking care of the values. But in ophthalmology, we really rely on the value obtained rather than to compensate. By this, I would thank you very much for your attention.
We don't have time for any question because we have trip afterwards. So thank you, Masoud.
That was a very nice presentation. The only thing that I would like to mention is that you might be encouraged also to look at what has been done 10 years earlier than what GM has done. And if you look at the papers of Larry, J. Nam, and my papers on refractive Zernike polynomials, or Zernike slope polynomials, you will see that that has been done much earlier and in a simpler form. And I encourage you also to go on my website. I have a nice MATLAB tool where, I know that's also for others of you guys, if you want to see that interaction between lower and lower higher operations and what actually happens when you remove the spherocylinder, the optometric spherocylinder, and what happens to them, that yes, the lower order are being balanced. So there's a nice tool that you can just run in MATLAB and have fun. Thank you.
Thank you, Masoud.
I'd like to make the point that we have to be very careful, because what the patient is doing when you're doing subjective refractions, they don't care about any of the math behind it. What they're doing is selecting the best sphere and the best cylinder that they like. You're never driving Zernike to zero. That's not happening.
Thank you. Let's welcome our last speaker, Konstantinos Ntatsis.
So I need to look at the screen a bit. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Konstantinos Ntatsis, and I work for the STIA system in Athens. And I'm also a PhD student in University of Murcia under the supervision of Harilos Ginis and Pablo Apal. And today, we learned that wavefront RMS is a bad habit, Zernike polynomials are a bad habit, so I'm going to use both of those in this presentation. Yes, what I'm going to show is how to retrieve a wavefront from point spread function, so from the a bit of background. Okay, everybody knows this stuff, that when we have a zero aberration system, the PSF that we get is diffraction limited. And while when we have an aberrated system, the wavefront deviates from the spherical, and we get a more spread out PSF. And on the bottom we can see the wavefront. Basic stuff, but what we know is that nature goes from the wavefront to the PSF. And the question is, can we go the other way around? So can we go from the PSF to the wavefront? And actually this is quite interesting, because then we could do a couple of stuff like doing adaptive optics without the need of a sharp hard mount sensor. Or we could turn any system that has lenses in the camera to an aberrometer. And of course this field is not new, it's several decades old, and it's called phase retrieval. And the idea is that yes, you go from the PSF to the wavefront, and the most well-known algorithm is the Getzberg-Saxton. There were several different algorithms built on top of that. However, all these methods are very sensitive to initial conditions. They are hard to make them converge, and also they are quite slow due to their iterative nature. So, So what we propose instead is to use deep learning to do the phase retrieval. So a bit of our method. Okay, first of all, I need to mention that everything that you will see from now on is simulated data, so no experimental data. And this is a hypothetical double pass system. So the light goes through a very small aperture, for example 2 millimeters. It forms an image at the back of the eye. And because the aperture is so small, we know from the literature that it will be diffraction limited, or an approximation would be that it will be And then this light is reflected back, passes through the normal pupil of the eye, so 5 millimeters, and forms an image in the camera. And the final image will be a combination of the two. So it will be a cross-correlation, or you can think of as a flipped convolution between the first pass and the aberrated second pass. So this is what we get. But of course, one is not enough. We need a lot of those to create to train a network. So what we're going to use is the Zering maps. And we are interested in those because we also have normative data from healthy eyes. So we are going to do a bit of simplification here. We are going to assume that the Zering coefficients come from Gaussian curves. And we have different ranges for the lower or higher order aberrations, and we use 12 of the Zering coefficients. So these are the ranges at the right. And this is how we are going to simulate a dataset to train the model. The idea is that we start from the distributions that I told you about, and then we assemble randomly. We combine the Zering polynomials to form a new waveform, and then we take the Fourier transform to create a PSF and combine with the first pass diffraction limit PSF to get our final image. However, we saw it previously in the chromatic aberration talk. This is not enough to go back to the waveform because there is, I will not get into much detail, but there is a kind of symmetry in the even circuit terms. So we need additional information. And the additional information will come here from just adding a bit of defocus in the first waveform, and then repeat the same process of creating a second PSF that's identical to the first one, plus a bit of defocus. And we chose 0.5 plus defocus, but it's arbitrary, it could be something else. And again, training a deep learning model is data hungry, so we need a lot of these images, a lot of these pairs, and we create 40,000 pairs that's done very quickly in the GPU in less than 10 minutes. And this is how they look like. At the left are the PSFs that are of interest to us, and at the right are the same PSF plus a bit of defocus. And this is how we train our model. We have the dataset at the left that we just saw. We feed it to the network, and we ask it to predict the Zering coefficients that created each individual PSF. And because we know the truth, we know what we use to create the dataset, we can compare the prediction of the model for each of the PSFs to the input label. And we calculate the RMSE, it's just a loss that we can use to update the weights of the model again and again until our model does a strong prediction. And this is a typical training curve. We see at the x-axis is the loss, the RMSE of the prediction and the input labels. And at the x-axis are the epochs. Epochs means how many times the model has seen the whole dataset. And you can see at the beginning the model doesn't do good predictions, but as progressively learns, it improves on its predictions. And this whole process takes a couple of hours. However, when this is done, we can keep the parameters of the model, so the weights of the model fixed, and it can do inference, so it can predict on a new pair of PSFs in 4 milliseconds, so very fast. And in order to show some results, we produce a further 10,000 PSF pairs to validate the model. And these are the results. So here you see the difference between the prediction of the model and the input coefficient labels. And we can see the scale, so it's 0.1 micrometer. And if we assess from some outliers, it's very close to 0. And in fact, the mean input RMSE was 0.16 approximately. And the mean residual RMSE, so after the model prediction, is 0.0039. So it's only 2.5% approximately left as an error. Of course, maybe this doesn't mean anything to us. So let's see some qualitative results. At the left, it's a comparison again on a specific example out of the 10,000. This is just a random example. And you can see how closely the model with the orange matches the input label for the coefficients with blue. And on the right are, if we take these Zernit coefficients and we create a wavefront, and then we're using Fourier transform to create a PSF, we can compare also in terms of wavefront and PSF. We can see that they closely match each other. But maybe you are suspicious and you say, okay, this is a cherry-picked. So I'm going to show actually the worst result out of the 10,000. And you can see here now, okay, the prediction of the model is slightly worse. But still, if we check the wavefront and the PSF, they are very closely to each other in terms of shape. Of course, in the PSF there are some pictures that are very different, but they are only individual pictures. And just to make it more clear, we can compare the astigmatism, the residual RMSE, and it's 0.07 micrometers in this example, which is approximately 0.1 cylinders, so quite low. In conclusion, we developed a method to retrieve the wavefront in one shot from PSF images. That's done very quickly in 4 milliseconds, and it's with high accuracy, so 97.5%. But of course, we need to keep in mind that these are simulated PSFs and not experimental. So as a future work, what we would like to do is to incorporate straight light modeling into our PSFs and also add Gaussian noise that can be thought as thermal noise of the camera, and also Poisson noise that can be due to low photon noise. And we would like to validate our method using an experimental setup. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. I think that artificial intelligence in general, not only pure neural network are the future of many fields, but where can we find the details of the model of the neural network and the software environment you used? Okay, the sampling, the pre-processing, post-processing, there are many things that you didn't talk about, but they're very interesting for me.
Yes, because I didn't want to put too much information, I didn't include it. But we're planning to release the code when we continue with the modeling. I have some information here, so if it's of interest to you, but I think that most people don't work with this stuff, so I didn't...
Right, but I recognize DensNet, okay, it's good for me.
Yes.
Did you use any type of sampling? Because most of these neural network models require to downsample the images.
Yes, that's right. So the wavefront originally is around 1000 by 1000 pixels, and then when we go to the PSF level, we downsample to 128 to 128.
Okay, thank you very much.
We have time for 2 questions.
Okay, very good question. So this is basically an inverse problem. So you have trained your neural network to solve the inverse problem without using an iterative algorithm. My double question is, have you also trained the direct problem? And also, have you tested the stability of the identity operator, the estimation of the identity operator, going back and forth using both trained inverse model, trained direct model?
Regarding the first question, you mean as a validation? Because it's direct. No, we didn't test it. But yes, because it comes directly from the theory, we didn't work on that. We just take the Fourier transform. Yeah, and the second question, I know it's, I don't remember the name, but I know it's, how's it called? Anyway, it's common that you ask the network to produce its input, just again for validation, but yes, we didn't do that.
It's interesting to see after how many iterations of going back and forth it starts to diverge.
You mean to say it's diverges? I don't think that it will diverge, but I can
you can try it.
Yes.
A comment for a suggestion that you might consider looking at pairs or triplets or even more wavefront generated point spread functions in your as your raw data, instead of having a single snapshot with known amounts of defocus it may constrain the solution, make it more accurate and more precise, and you might be able to take advantage also of accommodative fluctuations. Even though you don't necessarily know how much that fluctuation is, it might still constrain the solution by having a series of Weisberg functions for different levels of defocus from the same eye.
Yes, thank you. We are working on a few focus system that use all the three images, but because this is theoretical work on simulations, 2 is the minimum required to retrieve the wavefront. So maybe a third image can add information, but 2 is the minimum. 1 is too little, and 3 is maybe extra information. But yes, thank you.
Thank you.